Shooting photos in JPEGs are usually considered a cardinal sin amongst photographers, but accidents happen. Sometimes your RAW files get lost or corrupt, or maybe your camera switched over to JPEG shooting only, and now you're afraid you lost all your once-in-a-lifetime memories. But don't worry, only having JPEGs does not mean that your photos are destroyed. However, for you not to destroy the photos during an edit, there's a few things you need to keep in mind. So don't skip, because all the answers are coming right now. But first, what is a JPEG? And why is it that so many photographers choose to use RAW files instead? A JPEG is a lossy file format, which means it compresses the image down so that the file size is smaller. RAW files contain all the uncompressed and unprocessed image data captured by the sensor of your camera. So basically, JPEGs are images, while RAW files are simply just data. And that brings me to the main reason why most photographers tend to shoot RAW, which is because it gives you more freedom and forgiveness when you're shooting and editing. Firstly, you usually have a much wider color spectrum, usually going from 12 to 16-bit, compared to the JPEGs, who are usually around 8-bit. You also get the freedom to change your white balance afterwards, and RAW files also help you capture more dynamic range, which is just a name for the range of how dark the darkest part of your image can be and the brightest part can be, and still keep details. But I still believe that you have to try to capture the best image that you can in camera, which means to get the correct white balance as well as the exposure. Not only so you don't have to change as much while editing, but also if something happens to the RAW files and you're only left with JPEGs, you still have the correct baseline to work from. Now, let's move on to editing a JPEG. So right now, on screen I have two photos. I have my JPEG down here and my RAW file right here. And this is simply just to show you how much you can push the JPEG. So down here, we have the JPEG first. I've simply just set the RAW file as the reference photo up here. You can see it down here, you can just take it off. So right here, we only have the JPEG. You can see I can actually pull up the exposure quite a bit so I can get all the details down in the shadows down here. Right, as you can see, the shadowy part is actually keeping up fairly well. You can still see a little bit of detail even though it's very grainy. However, if I pull down over here by the sun, if I pull down the exposure, we're gonna get this gray tone instead. We don't get any details. You see the sky here, it doesn't continue. The same with this one. Doesn't really continue over, it just gets this grayish blob. However, if we go back to the RAW file right here, well, firstly, if we look at the shadows, it's still a lot of grain, but you can see a lot more detail in here, you can see a lot more grass. But if we go back to the sun over here, if I start pulling down the exposure, as you can see, look how far I have to pull it before it loses the brightness. This one is still very white, but look how much of the sky you can see. You can even see a flare right here that you couldn't on the JPEG. On the JPEG you can barely tell that there's a flare. So that's what I said, that was basically the main thing of the dynamic range. Then we also have the white balance here. If I pull it all the way on the RAW file, you can see it turns almost green. And same if I pull it the other way, we still see a little bit of yellow down here in the brights. And if I do that right here on the JPEG, as you can see, firstly, it just says 00 because it doesn't actually have a white balance, it's simply a photo. So I'm actually just adding some cool or some warm tones into the image. But if I just pull it all the way up to the top, and I do the same right here, and we can... So this is what happens to JPEG. If you pull up in temperature / white balance, it gets these yellowish and greenish tones, where in the RAW file we still get this nice sunset, warm, orangey tones. So you can see the difference again. It didn't actually change any of the brightness in the sky on the RAW file, however it did on the JPEG. Look at how dark the sky is right here, compared to when we pull it down to the blue, it almost turns purple and brightens up. It does the same when we pull up in the warmth. So if we don't touch it, it's actually the darkest part. And you can see it does that with the whole image, the grass blades and the shadows. That was white balance and exposure. So this right here is the photo right next to one another. As you can see, there's actually not much difference in the RAW file and the JPEG. It looks to be basically the same if we look at the noise and the details and the shadows. But it's only when we look at the highlights that we get the biggest difference here. The blue-grayish tones with the warm white tones over here. So the way I would edit this one would be a little more excessive than what I can do to this one. And the last thing I want to take a look at is the hue and saturation that you can pull in the JPEG. As you can see, these two files are basically the same in vibrance. And that's because vibrance work in a different way than saturation does. Saturation usually just pulls up the colors on the whole image, while Vibrance usually goes in and analyzes the image and only pulls up certain colors. And if we pull saturation all the way up in both images, we get something like this. Still, the sky and the sunset over here is not the biggest difference in these two. However, the foreground is definitely changed. Over here you get much more yellowish, greenish tones, while here it's more deep orange and a little bit more reddish tones. So as you can see, you can still push your colors to a certain extent. So if I take a look at this photo and I want to edit it, the first thing I'm gonna do is, firstly, well, it was a bit windy when I took the photo, so I am not completely straight on. Just gonna reframe it here, something like that. Just have a flat horizon. Usually the first thing I would do was to go into lens correction and add these two, but since this is a JPEG and we don't have the raw data, it's not going to be doing much for us. I could go in manually and remove chromatic aberration, but this image does not need it. So instead, I'm going to just start with my basics. I know I can pull down my highlights because I know it's going to wash out my whites, but I can do this small trick where I pull down the highlights and then pull up the whites. And if we take a look at what that did, it just gives us a little more detail, but still keeps the bright part bright, so we don't get the grayish tones. And to see before and after, you simply press Y or Shift Y to change the viewing angle. Yeah, then I would most definitely pull up my shadows because I know JPEGs can hold that very well, just to be able to see a little more detail in the foreground here, something like that. Then maybe I would do a little bit of dehazing to make it a little more soft. And then again, to counter that, I'm just gonna pull up clarity a little bit, just to make the grass pop a little more out. I would go into tone curves and I would just lift up my blacks a little bit. 4 is good, and then create my usual small S curve here. You can see before and after here. It just gives a little more of a nice contrast in the image without removing any of the details from the blacks. Then I would probably go down to the details tab here, and I would not sharpen it very much. And right now on the screen, everything that's white is what's going to be affected by sharpening. And we just want to remove all of that, so we only sharpen the big lines, something like that. And I'm going to pull down on detail so we don't have too much, as you can see how crazy it can get if I just pull it up to the highest point. Right, something like that. And then we're going to go into the noise reduction. I'm going to zoom in right here. If I pull it all the way up, you see we lose all details completely. And if I pull up all this detail, we're going to keep a little bit more of it. So I'm going to pull this down to something like this one. Do a before and after. It just cleans up this dark area right here. And remember, this one is a JPEG, so it's incredible that we can actually do stuff like this. Now you can change your colors a little bit. I would probably try and pull my yellows over to the orange. And again, you have to look out for over-saturating your image. If you look at the sky right here, you start getting these lumps and spots all across the sky here and this weird line. And that's simply what happens when you oversaturate a JPEG, because there's not much data there in the color. So pull that down and just stick to the hues. Again, don't go too much in the hues, because then again, as you can see right here, the line comes back. So you have to be careful not to do too much, but you can still push it a little bit more. Something like perfect. And again, if we're talking about the JPEG, you still have a lot of detail in the shadows, which means that you can still work with those. So what I'm going to do here is just going to give it a simple grade, just so we can have a little bit of an orange and teal feel. I'm going to blend that in a little more here. And I think I'm going to go back up here just to pull the blues a little over to the teal as well. And again, I don't want to overdo it because we get the sky here, it can crack. And if we look before and after, let's see like that. And look at how much data we actually pulled out from this simple image over here, how dark it was and how much data there's still in there. So the main things to be careful of when you're editing a JPEG is the highlights and the colors, as well as the white balance. And you can see if I go back to the raw file here and I throw on the same editing, you can see the difference right here. And if you ask me, I would still say that this image is very usable. And there you go. If you learned something about editing a JPEG, give this video a like. I also think you're going to like this video right here about how to grow your photography business and do the work that you want to do.